Story 1. The Haunting of Emily Carter. Emily sat hunched over her desk, the glow of her desk lamp casting long, harsh shadows across the cluttered room. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now felt like a prison. Her textbooks were scattered around her, their pages filled with biological terms she couldn't quite grasp. The hours had blurred together, each minute stretching longer than the last, as she fought to stay awake. She had been studying for hours, no, days, and sleep had become a distant memory. The final exam loomed like an insurmountable mountain, its weight pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Outside, the night was still. No one was awake but her. Her roommates had long since retired for the night, their murmurs drifting from under their door as they slept soundly. Emily felt the sting of their absence, each whisper, each small sound, served as a reminder of how alone she was in this tiny dormitory room. The exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but she forced herself to stay awake. The hum of the lamp, the rustle of pages turning, and the occasional screech of the chair against the floor were the only sounds in the room. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting the pull of sleep. She couldn't afford to sleep, not now, not before the exam. She gripped her pen harder, scribbling notes, but the words blurred together on the page. A sudden chill swept through the room. Emily froze, her body tensing involuntarily. It wasn't just the air, this was something deeper. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she felt like the room itself had shifted. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the walls in unnatural ways. Emily shook her head, willing herself to focus. It's nothing, just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But the air grew thicker, and then she heard it, the whisper. Soft, almost inaudible at first, but unmistakable. Emily. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, eyes darting to the corner of the room. The space there was darker than the rest, as if the shadows were thicker, deeper, more alive. But no one was there. The whispers came again, and this time, Emily couldn't breathe. Her body went stiff. A coldness seeped into her bones, and her limbs felt frozen. She tried to scream, to move, but her body betrayed her. She was trapped, locked in place, her chest rising and falling in panicked, shallow breaths. The figure appeared then, standing at the foot of her bed. Its shape was barely discernible in the dark, but Emily could feel its presence pressing down on her. The cold touch on her forehead sent a wave of terror through her body. She couldn't scream. She couldn't even blink. The figure's breath was cold on her face, its whisper sharp against her ear. You will never escape the darkness within. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. But the weight of its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. Emily's mind felt like a foggy maze, every thought clouded by the exhaustion that had taken root deep in her bones. She hadn't slept in what felt like days, and though her body screamed for rest, she couldn't afford it, not when the exam was just hours away. The constant hum of her lamp, the rustle of paper, the flicker of the pages beneath her fingers, everything felt distant, detached. She couldn't focus. She couldn't think. It was as if something inside her had snapped, leaving only a hollow shell desperately clinging to the last remnants of sanity. The room, once familiar and comforting, now felt cold, unwelcoming. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, twisting and coiling like living things. They whispered to her, low and indecipherable, yet their presence was unmistakable. Emily tried to ignore them, to push the creeping fear away, but the room grew colder, the air thicker, as if something was pressing in from every direction. A soft, familiar whisper echoed through the silence. Her name. Emily. Her heart leapt in her chest. The voice wasn't her own mind playing tricks, it was real. She turned, eyes scanning the darkened corners of the room. But no one was there. No one could be there. She was alone. She had to be. And yet, as she tried to convince herself of that, the temperature dropped further, a biting cold spreading from the floor to the ceiling. She shivered violently. No, it's just the exhaustion, she thought, but the voice came again, louder this time, as though it was right beside her. Emily. Her breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, to get up, but her body wouldn't obey. It felt like a vice had clamped around her chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. She was paralyzed. The cold suffocated her, and the darkness pressed in, warping the walls and floor until the room seemed to tilt and sway. The figure emerged from the corner, its shape barely visible in the suffocating dark, but Emily could feel it. She could feel the malice radiating from it, the hunger in its presence. It was close, so close she could feel its icy breath on her skin. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The shadows seemed to wrap around her like tendrils, choking her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. "You are mine now," the voice whispered, sharp and taunting, as the cold hand touched her forehead once more. And then, as if on command, the weight of it all pressed harder, and Emily's vision went black. Emily's exhaustion had become unbearable. The days blended together, each hour dragging her further into a state of numbness. The looming biology exam felt like a distant, unreachable goal, a cruel reminder of the stress that threatened to suffocate her. But it wasn't the exam that haunted her anymore, it was the thing that lurked in the dark corners of her room, the thing that had claimed her nights, twisted her dreams, and left her paralyzed with fear. She had tried everything, lights, music, even desperate calls to her family, but nothing worked. The dark presence only grew stronger. The whispers had escalated, morphing into guttural growls that seemed to shake the very walls of her room. Her body trembled with each passing minute, but she couldn't escape it. The shadows had become her prison. Tonight, she could feel it again, the cold, the suffocating stillness, the air thick with something malevolent. Emily had finally reached her breaking point. She was done hiding from it. She couldn't run, couldn't sleep. So she would face it. Head on. As she lay in her bed, her heart pounding in her chest, Emily steeled herself. The whispers were already there, slithering through the dark like serpents, winding around her thoughts. She tried to push them out, but they dug deeper, clawing at her sanity. Suddenly, the room went completely still. The air felt impossibly heavy. Emily's breath hitched. She knew what was coming. She could feel it creeping closer, its icy fingers brushing against the back of her neck. The darkness in the corner of the room stirred, and there it was, its shape, a grotesque mass of shifting shadows and jagged, nightmarish limbs. Emily's body seized up, paralyzed once more. The shadows pressed in around her, swallowing the room whole. The entity stood before her, its form towering, its presence suffocating. She could barely make out its face, if it even had one. But she could feel its eyes, burning into her with malicious intent. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice a low growl that rattled her bones. "I am inside you." Emily fought against her paralysis with every ounce of strength she had left. She couldn't let it win. She had to break free. With a strangled gasp, she managed to move a single finger, then another, then her entire hand. The shadows recoiled for a moment, and in that instant, Emily screamed. It was a sound of defiance, a sound of desperation. And just like that, the dark figure faltered. But before it vanished completely, its voice echoed one last time. "This is only the beginning." And as the darkness receded, Emily was left gasping, her heart racing, uncertain of what was to come. Story 2. The Silent Watcher. The night was oppressive in its stillness, thick with the heavy silence that only a darkened museum could provide. Sarah Bennett sat alone at the security desk, the fluorescent lights flickering above her head, casting sharp shadows across the empty halls. The museum, usually alive with visitors during the day, was now a ghostly labyrinth. She had been working the night shift for months, and the isolation, once a comforting solitude, now felt suffocating. The air was stale, smelling faintly of dust and old wood. Her body ached from exhaustion, but there was no reprieve. She had to stay alert, constantly watching the monitors and walking the empty galleries. She had gotten used to the eerie quiet, the hum of the security cameras, and the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath her boots. But tonight felt different, unnatural. The building seemed to shift around her, as if the walls were alive, breathing softly in the dark. A cold draft slid through the vents, making her shiver, but Sarah dismissed it. The museum was old. Old buildings creaked and groaned. It was nothing. Her eyes burned from the hours of staring at the screen, the security footage looping endlessly. Her mind had begun to wander. Was this what her life had become? A series of sleepless nights in the dark, surrounded by silent, ancient exhibits? She needed rest, but the thought of leaving the desk, even for a moment, was unbearable. The museum was her responsibility, her domain for the night, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. A sound broke the silence, a low, almost imperceptible scrape across the floor. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. She swiveled her chair, scanning the empty hallway on the monitor, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the stillness of the museum's quiet corners. Her breath quickened, but she forced herself to exhale. It's nothing, she thought, shaking her head. Just nerves. Then, the whispers started. Barely audible at first, a soft murmur of voices that seemed to drift through the air, as if the museum itself was speaking. Sarah's stomach churned. Her gaze darted to the hallway outside the security office. Still nothing. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The whispers grew louder, clearer now. Sarah. She froze. The voice was unmistakable. Her name. But there was no one there. The lights flickered, plunging her into darkness for a split second before they came back on. When they did, the shadows in the hallway had deepened, stretching unnaturally across the floor. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, its shape indistinct, like a blur of darkness. Her breath caught in her throat, and before she could react, she felt the unmistakable weight of fear press down on her chest. The cold was back, more biting now, and she couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She was paralyzed, trapped in place by something far worse than exhaustion. The figure moved toward her, silent as death. Sarah had never been one to jump at shadows, but the eerie stillness of the museum was beginning to chip away at her rational mind. The air, once merely stale, now felt thick, heavy, as though it had a weight all its own. Each breath she took was a struggle, as if she was fighting against something unseen, pressing against her chest. The security cameras hummed monotonously, but their soft static only added to the sense of isolation that had taken root in her bones. The whispers hadn't stopped. At first, they had been distant, faint murmurs carried on the breeze, easily dismissed as her overworked mind playing tricks. But now they were sharper, clearer. They slithered through the walls, curling around her thoughts like tendrils of fear. At first, she thought it was the wind, or maybe an old ventilation system, but now, it was something else. Something far darker. The museum, once a familiar place, now felt unfamiliar. The corners of the rooms seemed darker, the hallways stretched farther than before, and the ancient statues appeared to loom, watching her every move. Sarah had always prided herself on being alone in her thoughts, but tonight, the silence pressed against her like a living thing, suffocating her. As she made her rounds, the cold spots appeared again, creeping into the back of her neck and sliding down her spine. She could feel it, the presence, following her, drawing closer with each step. She turned the corner, and there it was. The figure. Its shape was still obscured, but this time, it was undeniable. Something moved in the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim lights. Her heart pounded in her chest as her legs froze. Not again. She tried to move, to turn and flee, but her body betrayed her. It was as if her limbs were made of stone, locked in place. Her fingers tingled with the overwhelming need to reach for the flashlight at her side, but no matter how hard she willed herself, her body wouldn't obey. The figure shifted closer. Its presence was suffocating, a cold, unnatural chill in the air. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared, her eyes straining to make sense of the shadow. It was no longer just a figure, it was a mass, something made of the very darkness itself. It loomed over her, and then, it moved. Sarah. The voice came, low and breathless, as though it were coming from within her own mind. She couldn't scream. She couldn't blink. All she could do was stand there, frozen, as the dark shape reached out toward her. The museum had become a maze of shadows. Each corner seemed to hide something just beyond her reach. Sarah had wandered the halls for what felt like hours, her eyes flicking nervously to the empty corridors, her every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers hadn't stopped. In fact, they had grown louder, more insistent, creeping into her thoughts like an invasive melody she couldn't escape. They seemed to come from everywhere, behind her, beneath her, inside her own head. Sarah. She could feel it again, the cold, gnawing chill that gripped her, seeping into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, unstable, as if the very ground was rejecting her presence. She had to get to the security office, had to check the cameras, but something held her back. The urge to run was suffocated by the crushing weight of exhaustion that had begun to settle in her chest, making every movement feel like an impossible task. As she turned another corner, she saw it. The figure. But this time, it wasn't a fleeting shadow. No, it was solid, distinct. It stood in the center of the hall, its face still hidden in the darkness, but its form unmistakable. A tall, slender silhouette, its outline jagged, as though made of the very shadows that clung to the walls. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribcage, and her pulse quickened, but she couldn't move. Her body locked in place, frozen as though held by invisible chains. The figure stepped forward, its presence growing stronger, more suffocating. The whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sarah's breath was shallow, caught somewhere between terror and disbelief. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her body remained immobile, trapped by an overwhelming force she couldn't understand. The figure tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. There was something about its stillness, something unnerving about how it seemed to watch her, studying her every breath, every fearful thought. And then, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice rasped, not from its mouth but from within her mind. A whisper that rattled her bones, that slithered under her skin. Sarah's chest tightened, her vision swimming, but still, she could not move. The figure advanced, each step slow, deliberate, and as it drew closer, Sarah realized with a gut-wrenching certainty, it was never just a shadow. It was the curator, and it had been waiting for her. Story 3. The Curse of Hawthorn Manor. Nathaniel Blackwood pulled up the gravel drive, the tires crunching beneath the weight of the car as he approached the towering silhouette of Hawthorn Manor. The house loomed in the distance, a Gothic behemoth that seemed to scrape the low-hanging clouds. It was everything he had imagined, and more. The architecture was magnificent, but decayed, with ivy clinging to the stone like an ancient wound. The windows were dark, reflecting the pale light of the evening moon. A shiver ran down his spine, but Nathaniel dismissed it, shaking off the unease. He had seen plenty of haunted places in his career, and his job as an investigative journalist had made him cynical. This would be no different, just another story to unravel. He stepped out of the car and into the crisp night air. The smell of damp earth mixed with decay, the scent of something forgotten. The wind whispered through the trees surrounding the manor, carrying with it an eerie silence. There was no sign of life around, no birds chirping, no rustling leaves. It was as though the world had held its breath. The front door creaked open before he could knock. An elderly woman, her face sharp with age and worry, stood in the doorway. Margaret Hawthorn. She greeted him with a nervous smile but no words. Nathaniel couldn't help but notice the way her eyes darted around him, as though expecting someone or something to appear. "Welcome," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Please, come in. The house is quiet tonight." Nathaniel followed her through the dimly lit hallways, each step echoing off the wooden floors, amplifying the oppressive silence. He could almost feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, the air thick with centuries of secrets. The walls were lined with old paintings, their eyes unsettlingly lifelike. Something about them felt wrong, as though they were watching him. Margaret led him to the study, where an old fireplace flickered weakly. She offered him tea, but Nathaniel was too distracted by the room's atmosphere to accept. The shadows seemed to move with him, stretching unnaturally as if alive. The fire crackled, but it couldn't quite warm the chill that had settled deep in his bones. "You should rest," Margaret said, her voice low and strained. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Nathaniel nodded, too tired to argue, but as he climbed the stairs to the guest room, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the wind rustling through the trees, but they grew louder with each step. By the time he reached the door, the whispers were clear. "Nathaniel." His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't move. The night stretched on, thick with an unsettling stillness that wrapped around Nathaniel like a cold blanket. He had tried to sleep, but the bed felt foreign, the sheets too heavy. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, seemed to echo louder in the silence of the manor. His mind raced, sifting through his notes, trying to focus on the history of the house, but the exhaustion gnawed at him, leaving him weary, unfocused. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse with life, pulling at his attention with a quiet, unrelenting force. As the hours ticked by, the temperature in the room began to drop, a sudden, unnatural chill that sank into his skin and made his breath visible in the dim light of the lamp. He wrapped himself in the blankets, pulling them tight around his body, but it did nothing to stop the gnawing cold that seemed to seep into his bones. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. Then came the whispers. At first, Nathaniel thought it was his mind playing tricks, the remnants of exhaustion warping his senses. But the whispers grew clearer, more distinct, like a voice murmuring just beyond his reach. "Nathaniel. Nathaniel." The sound curled around him, cold and hollow. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, and for a moment, he questioned whether he was truly alone in the house. The door to the room creaked open, though he hadn't heard footsteps. The shadows seemed to stretch, creeping toward the bed, coiling like dark tendrils. Nathaniel's breath hitched as he sat up, his body stiff and uncooperative, as though an unseen force was holding him down. His limbs refused to move. Panic clawed at his chest. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat, suffocated by the silence. All he could do was lie there, paralyzed, as the shadows shifted. A figure appeared in the doorway, its form indistinct at first, then more solid, more defined. It was tall, too tall, with an outline that seemed to blur and stretch, as though it wasn't entirely bound by the laws of reality. Nathaniel's heart thudded in his chest as the figure stepped closer, the air growing colder with each step it took toward him. He tried to move, tried to reach for the flashlight on the nightstand, but his body refused to obey. The figure loomed over him, its face hidden in the shadows, but its presence suffocating. He could feel it, cold and ancient, a presence so oppressive that it felt as though the air itself had thickened. "You should not have come here," the voice rasped, low and hollow, like an echo from the past. The figure reached out toward him, its fingers cold and long, and Nathaniel's body stiffened, the terror washing over him in waves. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing closer, the whispers louder now, as if the house itself were alive, waiting. Nathaniel's body trembled, his eyes wide with terror, as the shadow loomed above him. The cold, unnatural air grew thicker, suffocating him in its grasp. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating through his skull, but he couldn't move, couldn't scream. His limbs were frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. His mouth went dry, and he struggled to breathe, but the air was too thick, too heavy. The whispers that had plagued him earlier were now deafening, circling around his mind, digging deeper into his thoughts. "Nathaniel." The figure stood over him, its shape still indistinct, its outline jagged and ever-shifting. He could feel its presence, pressing down on him, making his chest tighten, each breath more labored than the last. The shadows seemed to crawl, creeping along the walls like dark tendrils, tightening the space around him. The room, once comforting, now felt as though it was shrinking, folding in on itself. There was no escape. He was trapped. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice echoed from the figure, a sound so hollow and otherworldly that it reverberated through his entire being. It wasn't just a voice, it was a force, an invasive presence that seeped into his mind, filling every crevice with dread. He couldn't block it out, couldn't escape it. It was inside him now. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined, its presence more suffocating. Nathaniel's eyes strained to make sense of it, but his vision blurred, and his mind raced with fragments of thoughts. Was this the entity that haunted Hawthorn Manor for centuries? The thing that had been waiting all this time? He felt an overwhelming, primal fear. This was no mere ghost. It was something far older, far darker. He tried to move, to break free, but his body refused to obey. His mind screamed at him to fight, to run, but his muscles were unresponsive, paralyzed by an unseen force. The air grew colder, and the figure reached out toward him, its fingers long, sharp, and pale as death. It touched his forehead, and a jolt of ice shot through his skin, crawling into his veins, freezing his very soul. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice a chilling rasp that cut through the suffocating silence. Nathaniel's vision darkened, his strength drained, but still, he could not move. The entity's grip was tightening, pulling him further into the shadows, and he realized, with growing horror, that there was no escape.